So, hello and welcome to Project Oneness World. And today we are in conversation with Michele Cloonan, Dean Emerita and Professor at the School of Library and Information Science at Simmons College, soon to be University in like 3 days, Simmons University. And Michele was Dean for 10 years, from 2002 to 2012. And when I was hired in 2009, Michele was the Dean and she hired me. And prior to that, Michele was the chair of the Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. And Michele has worked at the Newberry Library, Brown University, and at Smith College. And she has published extensively in the areas of preservation, book trade, and publishing history, and other areas such as intellectual freedom and international librarianship. And her most recent publications have concerned the preservation of digital media and the cultural, moral, and ethical dimensions of preserving cultural heritage. And Michele has just come up with a new book, The Monumental Challenge of Preservation, The Past in a Volatile World by MIT Press. And Michele has held a variety of offices in a number of professional associations. Michele has won a number of awards, and she holds degrees from Bennington College, Vermont, the University of Chicago, and the University of Illinois, where she got her MS and her PhD. Michele teaches a number of courses. So thank you, Michele, for agreeing to be interviewed for this. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. And so to begin, could you tell us your story in your own words?
My story. I come from an interesting family background, and I realized at this stage of my life that it had an indirect as well as a direct influence on my whole life. So briefly, my mother and my aunt were born in Italy, and they were living in Paris when it was occupied by the Nazis at the outset of World War II, and my grandfather was Jewish. So they had to escape, and they came over to the United States on one of the last ships. My mother's family had been well-to-do, though the family lost most of their money during the war. And she didn't speak any English, and she'd gone to art school. And my grandparents separated after they came to the States, and they were in New York City, and my grandmother had to forge a career. She became a dress designer and a business executive throughout her career, but she cherished education, and she really created an environment in which it was possible for my mother and my aunt to excel academically. My aunt was and is brilliant. She got her PhD from Harvard in political science at a time when there were few women in that field. And Brzezinski, who was in the Carter administration, was her dissertation advisor. And my mother wound up moving back to France and teaching at the University of Paris. So my mother and my father met in college and had me. So my early childhood memories are of my parents studying, because my mother was finishing her bachelor's, my father was in grad school, and I remember
proudly. And this was in Paris?
No, this was in the United States. I was born in Chicago. My mother's family came to the United States in 1939. My parents met at Northwestern University, which is in Chicago. And so I was raised mostly in Chicago, though I had one grandmother in San Francisco and one in Manhattan. But growing up in an environment where people were always studying, I think had an impact on me eventually. And my aunt and my mother and my father were all professors at one time or another. Though my father left academia to start an association about 40 years ago. And at age 87, he just retired a few months ago. So that was an impact on my life. And also, I think what profoundly influenced me about my grandmother is that she was a great example of being able to start over. You know, to have to leave Europe, come to a new country, not speak English. She often said it was the luckiest thing that ever happened to her. And I said, how can you say that? I mean, escaping the Nazis and everything else that went with that, and having to learn English, as an adult. And she said, perhaps I would have led a complacent life if this hadn't happened to me. And that's the way she was. She lost most of her money towards the end of her life under circumstances I won't go into here. But she was such an upbeat, forward-looking, and brilliant person herself. She lived right across the street from the Morgan Library, which is now the Morgan Library and Museum in Manhattan, and took me there. And my trips to New York were all about cultural experiences. Puppet shows at FAO Schwartz, which was a fabulous toy store that was in New York when I was growing up. It just closed down a few years ago. Going to the park, going to the opera, going to the symphony, going to the theater, taking walks. She just really embraced New York City living and was highly energetic and creative. So she was really a tremendous influence on my life. My father was a maverick, a term they're using for John McCain so much now, but I think for my father it really fit. He was always curious about other things in the world. As an undergrad, he was a joint major in psychology and another field, and then he got an MBA, and then he got a PhD, and he did marketing and finance, and he started an association for individual investors, which at its peak had maybe 250,000 members. And my aunt is a political scientist and a poet. She's still publishing, and my mother died a couple of years ago, but she taught comp lit and various other things in Paris. So I think that I grew up with a lot of creative and restless people.
Yeah.
So that has influenced my life tremendously.
So what led to your current career, both as a leader in the field and in administration?
Well, this field was serendipitous for me. I wanted to become a lawyer. From very early age, I was going to go to law school. When I got accepted to colleges, I went to a law school in Chicago, and I just knocked on the doors of law professors, and I said, should I go to, school A or B, which will improve my chances of going to law school? And they must have thought I was cute or something, so they actually talked to me about it. But in my junior year in college at Bennington, Vermont, I happened to take bookbinding classes, and my whole life changed. I got interested in the history of the book. Simultaneously, I was writing my bachelor's thesis on the Shakers and Shaker poetry, and I had the opportunity to live with the Shakers in Poland Spring, Maine, while I was in college for one of our fieldwork terms. And I just fell in love with the book. So all of a sudden, in my senior year, instead of applying to law school, I applied to library schools. And that led to a whole nother set of adventures because I decided I wanted to be a book conservator, and there were no programs in the United States. So that led me to Europe, to living in Dublin, and to working in the conservation lab at Trinity College, Dublin. That's why I think that serendipity plays an incredible role in our lives, and we should embrace it.
Right, yeah. And one thing that I was thinking of, so you were dean for 10 years, right? And at your peak of your deanship or of your leadership, you decided that you want to step down and be a professor in the same college or in the same school. And why did you decide on that?
I think going back to what I was saying about my grandmother, I didn't want a life of complacency. I never thought I would do one thing for my entire career. But more than that, I think as an effective dean, you advocate for students and faculty, you develop really good staff, and you try to build a community. And so in order to do that, you have to love research and teaching, right, to best represent the people in the school, right? So because I liked the research and didn't want to give up on it, I found that it became harder and harder for me to be productive and also spend so many hours a week as dean. Because to do the deanship well, you need to be raising money, visiting granting agencies, bringing in new donors, meeting with students whenever they need you, meeting with staff and faculty whenever they need you. And for me, it was very much of a 24/7 kind of job. And the research became harder and harder to do, and I love that. So I wanted to give myself an opportunity to do that. And since I stepped down, I've had more time to be
Yes,
able
and
to
you
do
and
it.
you have done a lot. I think for the last, I think since 2012, you have edited the journal like every four
Oh,
issues a
right.
year.
I'd never edited a journal before, so I decided I wanted to try that.
Right, yeah.
And then I wanted to write books. And then my husband and I haven't collaborated very much. And my husband, Sid Berger, is a very prolific author.
Yeah.
So we're going to write a book chapter. It's been accepted for publication and it's due in February. So we're going to
Nice.
do a chapter together. And we also have a printing press. And we haven't printed anything for about 4 or 5 years, so we want to start printing again.
Yes, so tell us a little about your printing press, and that's very interesting. You have it at home, right?
It's in Arizona.
Is it Arizona?
Yeah. My husband, when he was a graduate student in English, learned fine press printing, and he has done some printing throughout his adult life, and we've done some printing together. It's very time consuming. I don't want to say it's more time consuming than painting, because I know you paint, but it takes a long time. You selecting the text, setting the type, doing the paper, choosing the best paper. But this summer, I decided I need a little bit of a break because I did a tremendous amount of writing, and we went to Minneapolis for a weekend of paper making.
Nice.
And that inspired me. We created sheets of paper that were evocative of the Southwest and the colors of the Southwest. So we will do something with those papers. There's a technique of pulp painting that's a little bit like painting. So I've never been good at painting. I envy you that talent.
No, you can always start that at any age.
I guess so.
Yes. That's interesting. And the reason I asked you the question on the stepping down part is because most people I know across the world strive for positions of power. Mm-hmm. And it's very rare that you see somebody voluntarily giving up a position of power. And somehow I think they get trapped in that because they are there and they're not able to escape from that life. And I think when you did that, I think it was very inspiring for me personally, and to see you do that. And as you said, right, because you wanted to do other things as well, and you were able to do that, and perhaps recognize that as a limitation of being trapped in that position, and being able to say that, okay, I've done that enough, and now I can step back and do other things.
Well, I made the decision that I didn't want to become president of a college. I had thought about that at one time. And if I had done that, that would have been really giving up research. Because once you go any higher than dean, that's the end of the road for research and teaching. When my husband was at the University of California, Riverside, before we moved to Boston, they had a very inspirational president, and he wanted to teach freshman chemistry because he thought he had something special to bring to that. I doubt anybody since who's been president or chancellor, as they call it, at the University of California campuses, has been able to do that. And it's sort of too bad because I think could be exciting for young people. But the demands are so great that it's just hard to do that. So once I made that decision, that was easier. There is precedence for that with the department chair model, because in a lot of departments you have rotating chairs.
Right, yeah.
So everybody knows that they're going to have to do their time. I think dean's a little bit different because you have the responsibility for development, trying to grow the school and everything else that you want to do. So it was a good experience to have had.
It was wonderful. And so who are some of the people who have influenced your work? You did talk about your parents and your aunt and your grandmother, right? Mm-hmm. And apart from them, other people who have influenced your work or your life?
I've had some good colleagues in the profession who've influenced my life. It's interesting. I never had a mentor in the classical sense. The first 2 people I worked for were very difficult. They were very disputatious and moody. And yet I learned a tremendous amount from both of them. So I think that's mentoring is a really interesting thing. And I was just talking to Sanda Erdeles about it this morning. I'd love to find a new way to mentor faculty, because in some ways I feel as though rather than being mentored, fear was instilled in me when I was an assistant
Mm.
professor. You better start producing now. Don't even think about teaching in the summer. You have to have
Right.
single authored things, and they have to be published in A, B, and C places. And
Yeah.
there's got to be a better way than that. And I don't think schools have done as good a job as we could.
And I've thought a lot about that, I think. And I did meet a professor in one of, I think in an I conference, and she said that she decided not to have a child for 6 years because she was going up for tenure. And I told her, don't do that.
Yeah.
You have to live your life as well. And I think one thing we forget is that even as we are going up for tenure or working on teaching, research, and service, that you're also living your life. Those are years of your life.
Right. And I think when I first started in higher ed, and particularly I felt this at the University of Chicago, is there is no life but the life of the mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved the University of Chicago, and it was a fabulous place to go to school. But I think assistant professors were given a hard time there too, judging from what I heard from some of my professors. So actually, when I was chair at UCLA, we had a faculty member who got pregnant, and she'd been the first one in the department in like 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And it used to be very difficult for women in the academy to move up. I mean, my aunt's a great example of that. So, but the laws changed.
Yeah.
And, family leave is now possible for people, whereas it wasn't before. So I feel as though I sort of came up sort of at the end of the Army metaphor of higher ed.
Higher ed, yeah.
And I think that there does have to be a better way, because the young generation coming up now is not going to tolerate it.
Yes, yeah. And they shouldn't, I think.
They shouldn't.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the guts to not tolerate it, so we
Yeah.
just did what we were told.
And yeah, that's interesting. And so you have been a leader in the field of preservation, right? And you've published very widely in this area. Now you have your book in this. So for people who do not know about this, what does preservation mean?
Right. So that's an interesting thing. What is preservation? What is conservation? Basically, we preserve the natural world and the built world. The built world is everything from buildings to books, paintings, artifacts, any product of people,
Right.
is something that we can preserve. And actually, more and more, we're looking at not just the parallels, but the intersections of the environmental movement and the cultural heritage areas. For one thing, there's a real interest in sustainability in cultural heritage institutions. So there's certainly an intersection with the environmental movement there. But when I was doing research for this book, because I do have a chapter on sustainability, and I went back to John Ruskin in the 19th century when people started writing about pollution. One of the things I found in looking at the environmental literatures, they talk about the Sistine Chapel syndrome. It's a metaphor for them for the natural world. And it never occurred to me that environmentalists would take a metaphor from our world to think about problems with the environment.
And what's the syndrome? Sistine Chapel syndrome?
Well, it's not, I guess syndrome is the wrong word, but the equivalent to the Sistine Chapel might be the Grand Canyon. It's something that's a monument of natural creation,
Okay.
or the creation of people. I hate using the word mankind.
Right.
It sounds
Humankind,
so lofty.
humankind,
Whatever, of
yes.
humans.
Yeah.
And there's certain things that take on a greater importance and symbolism than does other things, right? So the Bamiyan Buddhas,
Oh, yeah.
which were destroyed on March 11th, 2001.
That is horrible. Yeah.
What 6 months before 9/11, 2001, and that wasn't a coincidence. That's an example of something that was symbolic, and therefore it was destroyed. But actually, I think what's going on in the current administration is we're going to have some of the battles we haven't had for 100 years about parks and wildlife in this country, as we're looking at privatizing parts of these parks or taking
Right.
away some of the lands that have been protected. It's horrifying.
Yes, yeah.
But anyway, so I think there's a lot of overlap there. And who's responsible? I mean, I think there's so many controversial areas. The editor, my MIT editor, asked me to write something about the Confederate monuments. The book was already written, so I wound up saying something about it in my preface. But the urge to destroy is as powerful as the urge to preserve.
And what are these monuments? You're talking about the Confederate monuments?
These are monuments, statues, mostly of Confederate soldiers from the Civil War.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that, unfortunately, in this country, we don't examine our history in the way that we should, and it's very contentious. And whereas there should be broad discussion, I also have a chapter in my book about Berlin, which has been a very inspirational city for me. I call it a preservation laboratory because after World War II, they had to take stock of everything that had happened, what to preserve, what not to preserve. And instead of trying to do the Holocaust Memorial in 1950, the way we tried to do the 9/11 Memorial, right after 9/11, they took a lot of time to think about what their history was. And then, of course, when the wall came down, what is Berlin? There's so much fascinating stuff going on there with the preservation of their city and coming to terms with the legacy of World War II for them. And we have never done that. We've never had a national reckoning about the Civil War.
Right, yeah.
And it's almost as though we can't move forward as a nation, in my opinion, until we come to terms with this. So I think we tend not to think of preservation in that monumental way, and that's why I linked monuments and preservation in this book. I talk about what is a monument at the beginning of the book and how do we preserve it. So I have examples, the Vietnam Memorial, and then the AIDS quilt. I consider the AIDS quilt to be a monument, even though it changes every day because people keep adding pieces to the quilt. It gets exhibited in pieces. These are all monumental things, and we have to come to terms with the preservation of these things. And then more broadly with preservation is linked to cultural heritage institutes and education.
Yeah.
And there's a basic human right to have access to our heritage and to learn from it.
There are some people who talk about detachment, and there's also a minimalism movement going on where people try to own less, right? And so when you think of minimalism or detachment, right, you try to not have too many possessions and not to preserve things or try to let go of things as much as possible. On the other hand, when you think of preservation and conservation, it's about trying to take stock, as you mentioned, and to keep, to try and preserve things for the future generations. So how does minimalism and preservation work together?
We just preserve different things. I mean, everybody has something that's important to them.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if you lost your children's photos,
right,
and they were gone forever, it would mean a lot. And that could happen because, maybe not to you, because you're more savvy about these things, but people think they're preserving their photos on Facebook.
Right.
There's actually somebody who did research on that for their dissertation at the University of Texas. And people are uninformed enough to believe that. So I think people are going to lose a tremendous amount of their personal history due to ignorance.
Right. Yeah.
There's no reason you can't preserve digital media, but it has to be done thoughtfully and deliberately. You can't just depend on the cloud. Actually, I remember teaching a class on digital preservation once, and one of my students said, "Why are we even talking about this? We have the cloud now." And I said, "Yes, who owns the cloud?
Yeah.
And how do you know that they're going to be around in 30 years when you want your pictures?" So yes, I mean, if my office is the perfect embodiment of the generation that collects things. And it's interesting because I'll need to clean this office out next year. And that one shelf in the back is my publications shelf. And to me, it's sort of it's one old big shelf is my publications, and I can physically see them. And they're going to go away. And maybe it doesn't really matter. But still, people might want to preserve games. They might want to preserve photos. There's going to be something that people want to preserve.
Right.
And we have to come up with strategies. But I'm glad you raised that because it's always been my contention that preservation is a social, cultural, and political act.
Yeah.
If we don't understand how people use information or how it's created, then we won't really understand how to preserve it.
And something interesting that happened, a conversation with my daughter. So my wife and I, we both paint. And my daughter said one day that, I think this is a good painting. I'm going to keep this. So then I asked her, so you're not going to keep the rest?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the kind of assumption that we have as parents is that our children are going to keep things, and it may be a burden for them. So we have to kind of
Right.
do the sorting for them in terms of what needs to be kept versus not.
Well, our son has told us there's only one thing of ours he wants, and we have a house full of stuff. So
Right.
now all of a sudden I feel this responsibility to begin to unload things in
Right.
my life so that he won't be stuck with it. And when you go to antique malls, it's just the symbol of all of these things that children didn't want after their parents died.
Right. Yeah.
Or sometimes you'll see a photo album in a flea market, and it sort of makes me sad because these memories have disappeared with the person.
With the person. Yeah.
But they will want to save something.
Yes, I think they will certainly want to save a lot more things, I think, than they realize now.
Yes, but I do have this conversation a lot with friends of mine as they begin to downsize. I think these conversations are happening.
Yes, that's
with
true.
Great regularity. And your daughter's already figured it out, and she's how old? 7?
Yeah, she's going to turn 10 soon. Yeah.
Oh, 10.
10. So, yeah. It's interesting because I remember having these conversations with Robin Peake, and whose father had just passed away, and she had talked about like inheriting certain things versus not, and she died soon after. So which kind of also talks about life and all that. But I think it is something that people grapple with as to what to preserve versus not.
Well, I think for me, because my mother's family had to flee Europe and very quickly, there wasn't generations of furniture and that kind of thing. So the very few things they brought, I treasure because I know
Right.
they survived war.
Right, yeah.
So I have silver and some books and jewelry, the kinds of things that they could carry with them. And it means something, but it won't mean anything to the next generation.
Right.
I was the last generation for whom that will be meaningful.
Yeah. So what are some of your life lessons?
None. I have no life lessons. I think it's important to do what you feel passionate about. We are so lucky, in higher education because we're doing what we love to do. I wake up in the morning and my biggest problem is that there aren't enough hours in the day because there's so much I want to do. And that's such a great problem to have.
Right, yeah.
So if I have any regrets, I think I've let the creative side of me go stale a little bit. So I'm hoping now that I'm only going to be teaching part-time that I can get back to printing and photography and do some other things because I think it's really important.
Right.
I think both our left and right brains need exercise.
Yes, yeah.
And we don't. And unfortunately now, you see in grammar school that they've gotten rid of so many arts programs, and yet it's so important. I was so blessed to have music in my life growing up, and it's still something that's so meaningful to me. And when I was in grade school, we learned how to read music. That was just part of the curriculum.
Right, yeah.
And we had instruments. Now you have to pay for all of these things, or they have to bring in teachers. Again, you have to pay because they don't have art teachers on staff. And I think that could be a terrible cultural loss.
Yeah. One thing that I remember from our early conversations was that one day I came to you and said that I finished all my work. And you said work never finishes. I think that was it was kind of an interesting moment for me because I was talking about that day or that weekend, but I think what you talked about was from a lifelong perspective, right?
I think so, because I'm always thinking about projects and things I want to research and places I want to go. And actually, that's something we haven't talked about a lot, but travel's been tremendously important to me. My grandmother took me to Japan when I was 14, and it had a profound impact on my life. She used to take apprentices for design, and she had an apprentice from Japan who invited us to go over there. And it was a culture that was so different from the culture I live day to day. And really, in 1970, Japan was a very different place than it is now. And I think one of the things that I realized for the first time was that the shadow of World War II impacted other parts of the world for decades.
Right.
It hardly impacted the day-to-day life in the States compared to what it did in other places. So it was really a very interesting experience of stepping backwards and forwards, because the Japanese are so brilliant
Right.
at inventing things. So they had things over there that we didn't have here yet.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it felt like the city was a lot older than, say, New York City or an American city. So that was a tremendous experience. And then just they didn't have video games back then. They had pachinko machines. So you'd go into these huge arcades that were noisier than anything you could imagine. And then you'd go to Nara, and there was this phenomenal Buddha. And it was the most peaceful, you'd have these Zen gardens. And the mother of the woman who interned with my grandmother had a flower arranging school. And just the attention to details in Japan, every leaf, everything in the arrangement,
Right.
means something. I was just completely overwhelmed in a very positive way. So I think that for me, traveling has just been a wonderful gift.
What does happiness mean to you?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's living a fulfilled life, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I think that you become more aware of the fact that you have less time as you get older. And I think, if I were to die tomorrow, I'd want to think that I was fulfilled, that I wouldn't have regrets. I mean, yes, I have regrets for things I haven't done, but that's just because you can't do everything, and so it's not a bad thing to have some regrets.
Right.
Because I just wish I could have done more. But I mean the kind of regretfulness where you're regretting the whole arc of your life, and why
Right.
didn't I do this? Why didn't I go to school? Why didn't I do, and I don't feel that. I just feel that there isn't enough time to do everything we want to do.
So when you talk about fulfilled, right? What does fulfillment mean? Fulfillment means, does it mean work?
It's just the arc of your life. I mean, I think it's loving what you do, feeling that it's important in some way, being able to engage with other people. I love connecting people. That's one of my favorite things to do. Helping other people find their voice. When they're in the program, I love advising students, and I like the internship class because it's my last opportunity to sort of help the students put the pieces of the program together.
Yeah.
Like, this is what I learned in class, and this is how I could apply it in a field setting. And, theory and practice really should come together. There should be that praxis in professional education. So I think that's what I'm talking about. It's just feeling good about what you're doing. I guess that's happiness.
Yes, and I think for the years that I've known you, right now it's almost 9 years. So I think I've always seen you working and content in a way that I think you were 100% where you were, and even as dean, you were very approachable, and as you said, right, you were always trying to connect people. The kind of advice you gave me was always about trying to help me succeed in whatever I was doing at that point in terms of my research and teaching. And I think you were very, very graceful as a dean all the while. And I think people will perhaps remember that, everyone. And there were a lot of changes during that time. There was reorganizations, and I think a huge amount of, as I think any dean goes through a lot of things, and you had your 10 years. But you had that calmness, I think throughout. And there were one or two times when I saw that even in the face of difficult circumstances, you were still very poised.
And I think that's because there's always great things to look forward to.
Right.
I think that what fuels me is, I've been getting emails from my new advisees, and they're all excited about orientation. So that's
Yeah.
great. That energy that you get the first week of classes is always great.
One of the key words that I've always known about Simmons is high touch.
Yeah.
Right, being there for our students. And I think you as dean, in all those years, I think high touch was a big part of what we had in terms of the level of support, both for students and faculty and everything. So I think that high touch is something, when I look back now, I think was a highlight of what you, I think, brought in as a culture.
Yes, I really wanted this to be a culture. One of the other things is I think that we have to value every person. Yeah. And the staff make our school successful too, and they're not always valued. So I think that that we should all focus on valuing each other. I wish I said thank you more times. I should. I'm so hyper sometimes I forget the niceties of life. And we should appreciate each other more. And I'm very guilty. I get so caught up in, getting a lot done that I forget to thank people.
No, I think you're one person who remembers, because I've received thank you cards from you, and I've thought that, okay, that's one thing I should learn from you to do.
Well, I should do more of that now. I mean, I try to remember, but I don't. Whenever I have guest speakers, I try to do a handwritten nice card, because it's just, as opposed to an email saying, thanks for coming and talking to my class. Yeah. But you can never do it enough.
Right.
People need to be appreciated.
Much more, yeah.
Yeah, they do.
And people thrive, I think, when they're appreciated.
I think you're right. I think they do.
So what are your goals now?
I don't have any goals. I was just having this conversation with someone else this morning. So as of July 1st, I'm technically part-time. What does that mean? I don't know. For someone like me, there is no part-time. But it means that my teaching load is reduced. Right. So I'm going to have more flexible time than I've ever had in my adult life. And I don't want to have a goal, because I want to be able to embrace what's out there. Now, having said that, I've got 2 books. One is in press, and another one I just finished with my co-author a draft of. So there's going to be work to do with that, and the chapters that I are working on, and I'm going to give lectures about this book. So I have those lined up. So it's not as though I'm going to be doing navel gazing, but maybe I should be doing navel gazing. Maybe I should go back to NARA. I think that we're so quick to fill up every minute of our lives. And
we need to create some white space.
Yes, and that's really hard to do. So I don't have a goal.
I think that's wonderful.
How about that?
Yes, I think it's wonderful. And any last advice or mentoring advice you have for people who want to follow your footsteps?
I think it's really important to figure out how to pace yourself. I think I felt very burned out by the time I stepped down as dean. I think that I overestimated my capacity to, be able to work 16-hour days every day or whatever. So I think that you can waste time if you're too tired. And I think you can be more productive if there's a calm in your life, that there's some sort of calm at the source. I've been very lucky in that I'm married to someone who's really supportive. And so at the end of the day, going home to someone who supports what I do is wonderful. Not everybody has that. Right. So I think that's important. But the pressure starts every day of our lives. And I feel this for young people too. Our kids are grown, but I have friends who have kids who are going to college. I think it's horrible what these kids are going through now. Yeah. Beginning freshman year, what they have to do to get into college, and how competitive it is, and how many places they're expected to apply to, and
everyone's trying to run God knows where.
It's and I think for me the pressure mostly came from myself, and I think that's better.
Yes.
Actually, although I think I come from a fairly accomplished family, they didn't put that kind of pressure on me. I think if I had said I don't want to go to college, I would have heard something about it. But, it was not, you have to go to school here, you have to apply to this many colleges. I think there was a certain faith that I would find my way. And I think that's disappearing now because we're pushing kids in a bad way. And are they going to have nervous breakdowns when they're 30? Right. I worry about that. you know?
I think to a certain extent, we are trying to live our lives in half the time. Somehow, I feel that people are trying to succeed in whatever success means much quicker.
Yeah.
And in doing that, they're forgetting to live in some way. In some way, not they. I think we, all of us, in some way. So I think that's some. There's some need to take a stock as to what does living really mean.
Right. I think that's true.
So thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. I think this was wonderful, and thank you for agreeing to speak.
Well, thank you. It's always wonderful to talk to you, Naresh.
Thank you. So are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Okay. And her most I think we need to take that off.
Might not be so. Oh, there you go. Okay.